My beloved child, your soulmate is saying, this may be the most important message I ever send you, and before you hear another word, understand this. They did not write these words casually, and they did not reach this moment without fighting a battle inside themselves. For longer than you realize, they have been carrying a sentence they could never find the courage to finish. They started it many times, erased it, stared at your name, closed the conversation, and told themselves they would speak tomorrow. But something changed. Something finally became impossible for them to ignore. And that is why this message feels different. There is a truth hidden behind every pause, every delayed response, every moment when they seemed close and then suddenly distant. You may have thought they stopped caring. You may have wondered whether the connection meant more to you than it ever meant to them. But what if the silence was never the full story? What if your soulmate was standing on the other side of a decision they knew could change everything between you? They have replayed old conversations in their mind, remembered tiny details you probably forgot, and questioned why your presence could still affect them after so much time. And now, the message begins with something they have wanted to tell you for longer than they will probably admit. There is something about you I never managed to explain. That sentence is only the doorway. Because behind it is a confession about what they felt, what they misunderstood, and what they secretly wish they had done differently. And the most surprising part is that the truth they are preparing to reveal is not about someone else. It is about you. There was a moment they remember with unusual clarity, a moment that looked ordinary from the outside but became unforgettable to them. Maybe it was a conversation that ended too quickly, a glance that lasted a second longer than expected, a message they read several times before answering, or a quiet moment when they suddenly realized that losing your connection would hurt more than they had allowed themselves to believe. They never told you what happened inside them during that moment. Instead, they protected themselves with distance. They acted calm when they were anything but calm. They convinced themselves that waiting was wiser than speaking, that silence would prevent disappointment, and that if this connection was truly meant to matter, somehow the right opportunity would appear again. But time did not erase the feeling. It made the question louder. What if I had just told the truth? That question has followed them. And now they are beginning to understand something that may completely change the way you interpret their behavior. They were not necessarily confused about you, they were confused about themselves. They had expectations, fears, old experiences, and assumptions that made them question whether they were ready for something genuine. You may have noticed moments when they seemed emotionally present, followed by moments when they disappeared behind a wall. That inconsistency may have made you wonder whether their feelings were real. But in this story, the deeper conflict was never simply whether they wanted you. It was whether they believed they could handle what wanting you would require. Because you were not just another person they could casually forget. You touched a part of their heart that made them look at themselves differently. And that frightened them. Not because you were wrong for them, but because being honest with you would require them to stop pretending they had everything figured out. Then came the realization they never expected. They discovered that pretending not to care did not make the connection disappear. In fact, the more they tried to bury it, the more ordinary things began reminding them of you. A familiar phrase. A certain song. A place they passed without expecting anything. A random memory appearing at the exact moment they thought they had finally moved forward. They began asking themselves why your name could still create such a powerful reaction. And eventually they reached the question that changed everything: what if I have been looking at this from the wrong direction? Suddenly, memories they once dismissed began to look different. The moments they called coincidence started feeling meaningful to them. The things you said that they once misunderstood began making sense. They remembered your patience. They remembered the way you noticed details other people overlooked. They remembered how you could make them feel understood without forcing them to explain every emotion. And perhaps most importantly, they remembered the moments when you gave them an opportunity to be honest, and they chose silence. That is the part they regret most. Not because they believe they can rewrite the past, but because they now understand that silence also communicates something. Every unanswered question can become a wound. Every delayed truth can create distance. Every opportunity ignored can eventually become a memory someone carries alone. And your soulmate knows they may have left you carrying questions they should have answered themselves. That is why this message is not simply about saying, "I miss you." Those words would be too easy. They are trying to say something much deeper. I finally understand what I was risking when I kept pretending this connection did not matter to me. But wait, because the next part of their message is where everything becomes more personal. They are not only thinking about what happened between you, they are thinking about what happens if they never tell you the truth at all. That possibility has become heavier than the fear of being vulnerable. They can imagine continuing their life, staying busy, meeting people, smiling through ordinary days, and telling themselves that everything is fine. Yet somewhere underneath all of that, there would still be one unfinished conversation with you. One truth never spoken. One question that never received an honest answer. And that is why they are finally preparing to send the message they once believed they could avoid forever. They want you to know that if they seemed distant, it was not necessarily because you meant nothing. If they hesitated, it was not necessarily because the connection was imaginary. If they disappeared into silence, there may have been an internal conversation happening that you were never allowed to hear. They are beginning to admit that they cared more deeply than they showed, noticed more than they confessed, and remembered more than you probably imagined. But there is still one detail they have not revealed. One specific realization changed the way they see your entire connection, and it happened after they thought they had already made peace with walking away. They discovered something about their own feelings that they could no longer explain away. And once they understood it, one thought kept returning: I may have been given something rare, and I almost let it pass without ever telling the person who mattered. That is the secret behind the message they are trying to send now. And what they say next may finally explain why your soulmate has been holding back for so long. The message becomes more honest here, because your soulmate has reached the point where pretending is harder than admitting the truth. They keep returning to one realization: they did not simply miss your presence, they missed the version of themselves that appeared whenever they felt truly understood by you. That is something they never knew how to explain. With other people, they could stay composed, predictable, and protected behind familiar habits. With you, something was different. You noticed the little changes in their voice. You could sense when their words were hiding something. You remembered details they assumed everyone would forget. And perhaps that is why they sometimes pulled away just when the connection seemed to become stronger. You were getting close to something they had spent years keeping private. They wanted to tell you everything, yet the closer they came to speaking honestly, the more they worried about what your reaction might reveal. What if you did not feel the same? What if they opened their heart and discovered that the person they had been quietly hoping for had already moved on? What if they waited too long? Those questions became a wall between you. But now they are looking back at that wall differently. They are realizing that protecting themselves also prevented you from knowing what was really happening inside them. And there is one memory they keep returning to because it carries a truth they cannot escape. You once gave them a chance to be real, and they answered with hesitation. They remember your words, your expression, even the emotional atmosphere around that moment. At the time, they thought they were buying themselves time. Now they understand that time does not always make feelings disappear. Sometimes it simply makes the truth impossible to ignore. Something else has been happening quietly inside them, and this is where their message takes an unexpected turn. They began comparing what they felt with you to what they experienced elsewhere, and the difference surprised them. They realized that not every connection made them think deeply about their choices. Not every person stayed in their mind after the conversation ended. Not every interaction made them question what they truly wanted from love. But with you, even ordinary moments seemed to carry an unusual weight. They could have forgotten 100 conversations, yet somehow they remembered one sentence you said months or years ago. They could have moved through an entire day without thinking about you, then suddenly a tiny detail would bring the entire connection back. And instead of dismissing it, they finally started asking why. Their answer was uncomfortable because it forced them to admit that you had become emotionally significant before they were ready to acknowledge it. They may have tried to label the connection as timing, circumstances, bad communication, or simple coincidence. But eventually those explanations stopped satisfying them. The real issue was much more personal. They were afraid of what your presence revealed about what they actually wanted. They wanted something honest, but honesty meant vulnerability. They wanted closeness, but closeness meant being seen. They wanted to know whether you could become part of their future, but imagining that future also meant confronting every unresolved part of their past. So they delayed. They watched. They waited. They hoped another opportunity would appear without realizing that opportunities do not remain open forever. And now one thought keeps returning to them: what if the person I was waiting for was already the person I was afraid to lose? That question has changed the way they remember your story. Your soulmate is no longer focusing only on what went wrong. They are noticing what was real beneath everything that went wrong. They remember how natural certain conversations felt. They remember moments when neither of you needed to force the connection. They remember how quickly time seemed to disappear when you were emotionally present with each other. They remember the feeling of being able to say something without preparing an entire explanation first. And then they remember the distance. That contrast is what hurts them now. Because when someone truly means nothing, there is usually nothing to revisit. But when someone matters, even the smallest unfinished moment can remain alive in the mind. They are beginning to understand that the connection did not need perfection to be meaningful. It needed honesty. And that is exactly what they failed to give you when it mattered most. They may never have said, "I was scared," but that may have been closer to the truth than you realized. Not scared of you. Scared of the possibility that you could become important enough to change their priorities, their expectations, and the way they understood love itself. They had built emotional defenses around themselves, and somehow you reached the other side without even trying. That is why their message is so difficult to write. They are not simply telling you that they remember you. They are admitting that they never completely stopped feeling the significance of what happened between you. And now comes the part they have rewritten in their head countless times, the words they wish they had said when you were standing right there, waiting for an answer. If they could return to that exact moment, they would not hide behind vague words. They would look directly at you and say, "I knew there was something different about you, but I did not know what to do with that feeling." They would tell you that some of their silence was not emptiness. It was an inability to organize emotions they had never learned to express properly. They would admit that they sometimes acted detached because being honest felt too exposing. They would confess that they noticed when you became quieter, when your energy changed, when you stopped reaching as often, and when you began protecting your own heart. They noticed more than they ever admitted. And that realization brings them to the most painful possibility of all. Perhaps you stopped waiting because they gave you every reason to. That is what they do not want to happen again. Not because they believe you owe them another opportunity, but because they finally understand that if they speak now, they must speak without pretending, without manipulating the outcome, and without expecting you to erase the past for them. Their message is becoming a statement of accountability. "I should have told you sooner." Those 6 words carry more weight than any dramatic declaration. Because behind them is everything they avoided saying. They are preparing to tell you what they felt, what they misunderstood, why they pulled back, and what they now wish they had done differently. But there is still one confession they are struggling to put into words, the one that could completely change how you interpret their silence. They have finally realized that the greatest thing they were afraid of was not losing you. It was discovering, after losing the opportunity to be honest, that you had been the person they should have chosen to speak to all along. Now your soulmate is standing at the edge of the truth they have avoided for far too long, and there is one thing they can no longer hide from themselves: they underestimated how deeply your absence would affect them. At first, they thought distance would make everything simpler. They believed that if they stayed busy, focused on other things, and stopped revisiting old memories, the emotional weight would eventually disappear. But something unexpected happened. The quieter everything became, the louder your memory seemed to grow. They started remembering details they had never considered important before. The way you reacted to certain words, the little things that made you laugh, the moments when you were trying to hide your own emotions, and even the conversations where neither of you said what you were actually thinking. Those memories became evidence of something they had been refusing to acknowledge. You were never just a passing chapter in their mind. You left an impression they could not simply erase by deciding to move forward. And that realization created another question. If they cared this much, why did they make it so difficult for you to know? Their answer is uncomfortable. They were trying to control an emotion that was never meant to be controlled through silence. They wanted certainty before taking a step, reassurance before becoming vulnerable, and guarantees before risking their heart. But love does not always arrive with guarantees. Sometimes it arrives as a feeling that asks you to become honest before you feel completely ready. And now your soulmate understands that waiting for perfect certainty may have cost them something incredibly valuable. They are looking back at the moments when you needed clarity and realizing that they gave you confusion instead. They are looking at the times you may have questioned your importance and realizing that their actions may have made you doubt something they themselves secretly knew. That is why the message they are preparing is not going to be casual. They are trying to correct a misunderstanding that has lived between you for far too long. There is another memory they keep returning to, and this one carries a completely different emotion. It is the moment they realized that you were no longer chasing an answer from them. Maybe you became quieter. Maybe you stopped asking questions. Maybe you simply began living your life without waiting for their next move. They noticed. More than they expected, they noticed. And that was when something inside them shifted. They had become accustomed to believing that they still had time to figure things out. Suddenly, they realized that you had your own heart to protect. You were allowed to reach a point where you said, "I cannot keep waiting for someone to decide whether I matter." Your soulmate understands that now. They understand that affection without clarity can become exhausting, and that even genuine feelings mean very little if someone refuses to communicate them. That realization forced them to confront themselves. They started asking whether they had been protecting their heart or simply protecting their comfort. Those are not the same thing. Protecting your heart can mean being careful, but protecting your comfort can mean avoiding the conversation you know you need to have. And your soulmate is beginning to recognize the difference. They are also realizing something surprisingly beautiful. Your distance may have taught them what your presence could never teach them. When you were available, they could postpone their honesty. When you became less available, they finally had to confront the possibility that they could not assume you would always be there. That did not make them entitled to your attention. It made them aware of its value. And now they are looking at the entire connection through a more mature lens. They are not asking, "How can I make you come back?" They are asking, "How can I finally tell you the truth without expecting anything in return?" That is a completely different kind of confession. Then comes the sentence they have rehearsed privately more times than you could imagine, "I should have told you when I had the chance." They know that sentence cannot change history. They know that saying it now does not automatically repair everything. But they need you to understand why their behavior never matched what was happening inside them. There were moments when they wanted to reach out but stopped themselves. Moments when they typed something meaningful and deleted it because they suddenly felt exposed. Moments when they opened your conversation, stared at your name, and wondered whether sending one honest sentence would change the direction of everything. They convinced themselves that silence was safer. Yet every time they remained silent, the distance grew. Every unanswered feeling became another layer between you. And eventually, they became trapped inside a strange contradiction. They wanted to be close to you, but they were afraid of what closeness would demand from them. They wanted you to understand them, but they were unwilling to explain themselves. They wanted the connection to remain, but they were not giving it the honesty required to survive. Now they see the contradiction clearly. And that clarity is exactly what makes this moment different. They are not trying to make their past behavior sound perfect. They are finally admitting that they handled something precious imperfectly. They may have mistaken patience for waiting forever. They may have mistaken silence for emotional control. They may have mistaken uncertainty for a reason to do nothing. But now they understand that some moments only come once. Some conversations cannot be recreated exactly. Some chances to tell someone how much they matter become memories if you keep postponing them. That is why they are no longer interested in sending a message that simply says, "I miss you." They want to tell you what the missing actually taught them. And this is where their message becomes almost impossible to ignore, because your soulmate has reached a conclusion they never expected to reach. They do not want to remember you as the person they almost told the truth to. They want to know whether there is still a possibility for an honest conversation between two people who once mattered deeply to each other. Notice the difference. They are not demanding an outcome. They are not assuming you feel exactly what they feel. They are not pretending that everything that happened can be erased with one emotional message. They are simply finally willing to stand without the armor they used before. They want to tell you that you mattered when they acted as though you did not. They want to tell you that some of their distance came from confusion within themselves, not a lack of feeling toward you. They want to tell you that your presence changed something in them that they were not prepared to name at the time. And most of all, they want you to know that if they ever get another chance to speak openly, they will not waste it hiding behind half-truths. But there is still one final piece missing from this confession. One realization came later, after the silence, after the distance, after they believed they had finally accepted the situation, and that realization forced them to look at your connection in an entirely new way. It concerns a question they once avoided because they were afraid of the answer. If I had been completely honest with you from the beginning, would our story have become something completely different? Your soulmate has been living with that question. And the answer they are finally ready to give you may be the most personal truth they have ever admitted about the two of you.